evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad KUTTAN.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with the former Prime Minister Datuk Sri Najib Razak's Sumpah Laknat, which he undertook after Friday prayers today. Now, a Sumpah Laknat is a religious oath asking for divine retribution in the form of a curse on those who are in the wrong. So it's not officially recognized in Malaysia's Sharia laws, and it's different to the oaths undertaken in Sharia courts here, where one swears by the name of God over their statement. So Najib performed his Sumpah Laknat to deny that he had ordered the killing of Altantia Sharibu. Now, some questions for us to consider tonight. Why perform this Sumpah Laknat, and who is it for?
Well, clearly, I'm not a religious scholar, Melissa, and I don't have an answer, at least from a theological point of view, about the Sumpah Laknat. But I think for his supporters, clearly this is more proof or evidence, I say in quotes, evidence of his honesty and his willingness to put himself out there in terms of the truth, right? So I think for the supporters of Najib Razak, this is a good thing, a good move, because it also is a demonstration of his piety, right? But
his
for the
Islamic
detractors,
fealty.
That's right. So for the detractors, of course, this is just more public dramatics, histrionics, an attempt to sway public opinion using images of himself praying and so on and so forth. They will, of course, bring up a number of counterfactuals. They'll look at other evidence, including the fact that this is a man who now stands accused of robbing the national coffers, and in many jurisdictions around the world. That story is very well established, most recently in the US again. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure, who this is for, apart from the public.
Yeah, or some segments of the public, right? So, it's just this really interesting thing. The Sumpah Laknat in Malaysia has been utilized before, particularly in political sex scandals. We've seen several times now where people have come up to say that they were willing to take a Sumpah Laknat to prove their innocence whenever accused of being involved in a sex scandal. Now, there's also people being involved in allegations of graft, taking on the Sumpah Laknat. And I'm wondering whether the challenge, when you're challenged to take a Sumpah Laknat, when in public you have been said, oh, well, if you are innocent, then why don't you perform a Sumpah Laknat to show your innocence? And the optics of not performing that when challenged. I wonder how that goes down with certain segments of the public.
Yeah, absolutely, But I think, Melissa, in some ways, it also goes back to the way in which the public can make a distinction between, declarations of piety, or declarations of innocence versus statements of truth. I mean, just because you say you are honest, doesn't mean that you are. For instance, and just because something ought to be done doesn't mean it is being done. And so those kind of subtle distinctions, I think sometimes are missing in the mix of this discussion.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention now to Australia, where the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has apologized for going on holiday in Hawaii this week, while the country's bushfire crisis there worsened. There is an interesting contrast in response to the situation in Johor. So the Johor Menteri Besar's office has actually defended Dr. Shahruddin Jamal's overseas trip after he was criticized of being away, this as thousands of orang asli were cut off by floods in Mersing.
Yeah, I think we've come, Melissa, to criticize our politicians quite vigorously, over...
That's a good thing, right?
Yeah, it is a good thing. But, over perceived, lack of concern about the public, or their desire to travel extensively on the public purse, so on and so forth. But I think maybe we have to look at the question of flooding. The one possible angle on this is not so much his failure to turn up or cancel his trip and so on and so forth, but whether Johor itself, because this flooding is a regular occurrence, has put in place the mechanisms or systems to deal and manage with the flooding, so that actually his presence isn't necessary.
Right.
In terms of managing the situation on the ground.
So you're saying if there has, because it is a regular occurrence, if there was actually a systematic disaster management approach, then we really don't even need our politicians to be on the ground. But what about the question of optics? And this was something that we touched on a bit earlier. The question of optics, because every by-election or even general election we talk about candidates having a presence on the ground, whether they're known by the people. And I think with these natural disasters is a great way to show empathy of the politicians, being there, experiencing the same types of deprivations that come with natural disasters will go a long way at the ballot box.
Yeah, it might be good politics, but it isn't necessarily good governance. And also, to be fair to all, I think, involved, it's sometimes what the public does is to weigh the importance of that event. You went overseas. In this case, it was about promoting education and along with other agencies, foreign agencies. Was that more important than showing the empathy? I'm not sure. Okay. But clearly, at the end of the day, the politicians will weigh up the trade-offs.
Right. Very quickly, I want to ask you, in comparison to the story that I brought up earlier in Australia with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, do you see that the similarities or distinctions to be made here? Because Scott Morrison was on holiday in Hawaii versus a working trip, to do with the state resources and state future.
Right. Okay. So there are two other dimensions that perhaps come into play. One is the severity of the situation in Australia. I think the death of several firemen, I think, was also what precipitated his concern or his need to express his concern. The question of the severity of the Johor floods, of course, the people who are suffering the deprivations will feel that this is the worst thing that could possibly happen to them. So politicians, could he have deputized individuals to take his place in this event? Yeah, he could have. I mean, the question is, as you say, the optics and how the politicians weigh that up.
All right, in other news, we have the Cato Institute recently releasing the Human Freedom Index 2019, which looks to measure the state of human freedom in the world. This is encompassing personal, civil and economic freedoms in the absence of coercive constraints. So let's look at Malaysia's ranking. Malaysia ranked 106 out of 162 countries, having fallen 3 places from last year. That's not very good. We're currently sandwiched between Bhutan and Nepal. And as always with these league tables, we often check out what Singapore's ranking is. Singapore is at 30th spot, unchanged from last year. So 30th compared to our 106.
Right. Okay, so in all these things, I mean, I think being overly concerned with the ranking is always a problem. I think what would be really interesting is the media took this seriously and looked at the breakdown. Because when you look at each of the elements in the calculation for the overall number, you have very interesting expressions of types of, I would say, value systems, right? What is it that that this particular index represents in terms of values? What exactly and how they define freedom, I think, is very important. Also, it must be noted when it comes to ranking, sometimes you fall 3 places not because you have declined in the scores, but because others have improved. And so I think what this report also does is allows you to see how Malaysia, at least from the viewpoint of those who constructed this index, have either improved or, have declined in our performance over the years. So that, I think, is also worthy of a conversation, at least.
Definitely. One of the things that I thought was interesting, I zoomed out, not just to look at what how Malaysia did, but in particular the effects of populism and especially authoritarian populism and that effect on freedom that can be seen in this report. If you take a look at, say, Turkey, for instance, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, his increasingly autocratic leadership has seen a notable decline for Turkey in terms of liberty within the decade. Among the 10 regions in the world, the largest drop of freedom since 2008 has occurred in the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, also considered the region with the least freedoms.
Well, because it's interesting because we just had the KL summit that purportedly brings leaders of Muslim nations together, looking at things like development, but also the question of Islamophobia. The question of freedom, though, and I don't think it's big on the agenda. And you look at many of the faces of the KL summit, they're not exactly icons of freedom and democracy. So this is one of the problems, I think, also that this index helps kind of highlight. At least it creates a conversation, I think, very important.
Exactly. And speaking of that, we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the KL summit and take a closer look at what it tells us about the prevailing tensions in the Muslim world. Stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you this evening. Now let's take a closer look at the ongoing KL summit, where leaders from some of the world's most populous Muslim majority countries are meeting. And they're meeting with the aim to address issues such as Islamophobia and poverty. But what does the KL summit tell us about the prevailing tensions within the Muslim world? To discuss this further, we have joining us on the line Umair Jamal, correspondent for The Diplomat, based in Lahore, Pakistan. Umar, thanks for joining us this evening. Now, you recently wrote a piece for The Diplomat in which you say the impetus for the KL summit is the issue of Kashmir and India's recent moves there. Now, I was wondering, could you help elaborate what you meant by that?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I mean, it has to be one of the reasons that that Kashmir issue was the part of the agenda of Mahathir Mohamad at the United Nations General Assembly's sort of address. So if we go back to what he talked about at the UN General Assembly, so he said that India had invaded and occupied Kashmir, which he declared an illegal move, an illegitimate move, and he mentioned that India needs to talk to Pakistan to resolve the issue. And so, you know, the summit was devised right after United Nations General Assembly address, and reportedly Prime Minister of Pakistan was also part of, you know, the group which actually proposed the summit. And similarly, if we look at Turkey, which is also one of the key members of this summit, they also criticized India's move in Kashmir, and they also said that India needs to talk to Pakistan to sort of, you know, you find a solution to the issue. And if we go to Iran, which is also attending the summit, Iran also in a rare criticism of India called it an ugly act and warned India, you know, to prevent confrontation with the Muslims. And this is not in India's interest that they occupy a Muslim majority region. So if combine all of that and you look at the, you know, countries participating in the summit, it becomes clear that one, all of these countries, they consider, you know, Kashmir not an internal issue of India, but sort of an issue which has regional ramifications and an issue which needs to be resolved, not bilaterally, but, you know, in discussion with, you know, with Pakistan and other countries. And second, if you look at, you know, what also is happening at the summit is, you know, you have a set of states which have issues with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has a very clear position in terms of where Kashmir stands. So for Saudi Arabia, Kashmir is an internal, you know, issue of India, which does not need an external, you know, party's intervention. And that is also what India's position is. And they sort of, you know, their partnership with Saudi Arabia is, you know, is sort of have economic nature. And that is where it's all, you know, some observers have based their observations in that sort of area. And,
Umair,
you know,
if I could just interrupt you, Umair, the question of the OIC, which has been for the large part the forum for Muslim nations to come together to create a united front on terms of global issues, why wasn't that the proper forum for this discussion? Why did those countries not use the OIC to push this agenda?
Right. So Pakistan has for a long time tried to, you know, bring Kashmir to the center of Organization of Islamic Cooperation agenda. But, you know, if you recall last year, Saudi Arabia sort of invited India to OIC, and it was invited in the role of as an observer. And Pakistan, you know, opposed that move, but Saudi Arabia still bypassed Pakistan and the other countries which bypassed Pakistan's sort of request was the states in the Gulf region. So it has had an agenda. The OIC has always looked at issues which are maybe closer to Saudi's interests and ignored issues which are not closer to Saudi interests. And that also involves, if you look at what has been happening in the last 2 years, is the issue of Yemen. So the kind of statements which have come out of OIC, they criticize the role of Houthis in Yemen, but also talk about unity and support for a regime which is closer to Saudi interests. So at OIC, the interest and the discussions have sort of focused on areas where Saudis want the discussion to be, and the other issues have been ignored. So I think that is one reason that maybe Iran, Pakistan, and other states, they've thought about maybe organizing an event could send a message to Saudi Arabia. OIC that is, of course, is a major forum, but there are other options as well. If the Saudi is posturing and sort of take on these issues continued as it is now.
Okay, let's look at the, as you put it in your article, the deliberate exclusion of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. How could that be a productive move, considering the heft that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has globally and in particular within the Muslim world? How could an exclusion rather than, say, building bridges been a good strategy?
Right. So I think it raises questions when you have one sort of group organizing an event, or maybe trying to develop a forum which does not have a representation of Saudi Arabia, or maybe which they are developing sort of forum which was not sort of consulted with the Saudi leadership, and then you have states attending that event. And they also have their ties have strained with Saudi Arabia over the last many years. Some in the case of Iran, this has continued for a long time. In the case of Turkey, the case of Khashoggi's murder and what has happened afterward, that is another sort of highlight of Saudi's strained ties with Turkey. And with the case of Saudi's relationship with the East Asian states, the relationship is not as warm as it was. So I think Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has not approached these states or maybe taken into account the interests or maybe the view of these states. So I think it has more to do with Saudi Arabia not maybe listening to what these countries want in terms of the issues of the Muslim world, than these states going against Saudi Arabia. I think the point is that these states, they want to talk about issues which Saudi Arabia is not interested in. So what
Right.
do? You have to go somewhere and talk about it.
Okay. Umair, as you correctly pointed out a bit earlier, the KL summit was initially driven by Malaysia, Turkey and Pakistan. Now, I'm trying to make sense of where Iran and Qatar sit in this mix. How important is the Iran-Qatar connection in this?
Right. So I think Iran's role is, I wouldn't say is central in the summit, but Iran wouldn't mind, maybe attending or participating in a summit where Saudi Arabia is not present, or maybe which Saudi Arabia opposes. If you look at what is being discussed as the summit, is that we are discussing issues of Islamophobia, we are discussing issues where Muslim world is divided, and when you look in the Muslim world, Saudi Arabia's role has been quite dominant in terms of the Middle Eastern crisis and the question of Yemen and what is happening there. Right. And so in that regard, Iran's position is quite clear. They would sit at any summit or forum where if such issues are brought to the attention of the world. And so I think in that regard, so Iranians wouldn't mind, but would they be willing to support sort of an alternative to OIC? That depends on who else is willing to look at that.
Yeah, on that score, Umair, do you think the KL summit has any realistic chance of becoming a rival to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC?
Well, at the moment, I don't think it has a sort of that vision, but it depends. If this summit becomes a regular thing, and the more and more states, they develop alienation in terms of what OIC is not doing. So maybe every other year, states come to the KS summit and they talk about issues which are not being discussed at the OIC. Then again, that could undermine the country's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia would not appreciate that. So I think it may be a one-off kind of event, but it's definitely a signal for Saudi Arabia that they need to hear what other states have to say, for which the OIC is a place, but it's not doing its job properly. So I think it's sort of at this phase it's sort of a messaging, but maybe in the next few years, if this continues to happen, this could develop into something.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amir, for joining us this evening and sharing your insights about the KL Summit. Now, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more on Consider This. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad, KUTTAN, and this is what we want you to consider tonight. So at the KL Summit today, Education Minister Mazli Malik said that Muslim countries need to reform their education systems so that we can have our own Greta Thunberg. Of course, Greta Thunberg was recently named Time Magazine's Person of the Year, but can we replicate her?
Yes. So I think we have a greater chance at this point, Melissa, of replicating her if this project was about bionics and, actually putting together some...
like a clone.
Yeah, a clone, right? And so this was actually sort of a genetic, biological enterprise. The question of culture, though, that produced a Greta Thunberg, and this is all over the world. I mean, there are a lot of young people who are inspiring, who are inspired, who do things and in some ways, are out of turn. So the question I would ask is, would you, as Minister of Education, tolerate a school strike? Something that Greta Thunberg did. Right. That was the start. That was the seed. Would we have, as a society, never mind the minister, would we have, as a society, appreciated a young child that went on a school strike? Exactly. I mean, when Greta Thunberg, I think, really hit the headlines, we had a lot of comments. And on social media, you could see the chatter on social media. Netizens saying, well, just stay in school. You're 16 years old. What do you know? You're simplifying the climate change solutions and this kind of sense of urgency and kind of character assassination we saw of Greta Thunberg. So I'm really wondering whether this call for creating our own Greta Thunberg, I love it, but are we really ready to if we have a Greta Thunberg in Malaysia, would we embrace her and put her up onto a world stage the way that the West has? Well, you see, that's the thing, right? So Greta Thunberg is not a Greta Thunberg in the sense of a global icon, right? For many years before she becomes one, and is that period, that incubation Correct. Of those kind of minds, that kind of dissenting views, respecting the dissent, right? And that passion. And the question is whether we as a society. I remember young kids in Penang going on a climate strike march, and a local councillor actually wanted action taken against the school for allowing the kids. Right. And so you see, it's not just whether the top leadership cares about it. It's like on the very ground, Melissa, do we understand what it is to empower children, respect them, and also respect dissent, just generally. Exactly. I really wonder, I mean, and perhaps this is what, to give the benefit of doubt to the Education Minister, perhaps this is what Mazli Malik meant by saying we need to reform the education system in order to have our own Greta Thunbergs, because without a full reform of the education system, there's no way a Greta Thunberg could be born and thrive in this type of society, right? Okay, well, that's all the time that we have for you tonight. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad, KUTTAN. We'll be back same time on Monday at 10 p.m. We'll catch you then. Have a great weekend. Thank you for watching and good night.